Welcome back to Leadership In. I'm Greg McDonald.
I'm Geoff Wallenitz.
We are halfway through the summer. So, Geoff, how's your summer been?
I'll tell you what, it's great. I'm in the last throes of my time in New York here, so I'm enjoying each of the last few moments I have. I just got back from Paris and I learned a little French. Je voudrais un petit gelato, which I said quite a bit while I was there. But other than that, it's really been a lovely summer. How about you?
Well, I am excited to go to a destination that is just as exciting as Paris. I'm going to my first state fair in Ohio next week.
Okay.
It's going to be paying homage to the butter cow. So, the French and the Ohioans have that in common, it seems.
Oh, definitely. Let me know which pig wins the blue ribbon. That's the most important thing going down there.
We'll have to put up some pictures of that. So we've been getting some pretty good response on these shorter open exchange episodes. They're about 10 minutes each. And so we're going to be doing more of them. And today we're going to do something a little bit different than some of the others that we've done so far, which is to bring on our first guest onto this short format episode. Lewis Rothkopf is someone that, Geoff, you and I have known for years. Lewis is an investor and advisor working across Adtech today, backing and guiding companies like Parazon, Protected Media, and Camcorder AI. His resume is a who's who of ad tech pioneers that includes DoubleClick, Brightroll, Millennial Media, MediaMath, and Martin AI, where he served as president through its acquisition by PubMatic. So if you've been in the industry for any length of time, you have certainly felt Lewis's fingerprints on it somewhere. So Lewis, welcome to the show.
I'm excited. This should be fun.
So Lewis, you've been through several eras in ad tech. How are you thinking about the future of the industry?
Yeah, so I've made my career as an executive in ad tech, and I love that the technology is able to bring buyers and sellers together to sort of hit that mythical combination of the right ad to the right user at the right time on the right device. What I've sort of seen in the past 27 years I've spent in ad tech is that the technology needs to disappear, right? Technology is meant to be an enablement layer that lets you connect the right user with the right advertiser, the right agency with the right publisher, and yet agencies are super, super interested in who the ad tech vendors are of the properties that they advertise on. And I don't just mean from a sort of corporate responsibility, sustainability standpoint, I mean the tech itself. And it's very similar to, if you were to be a media buyer buying a full page ad in a newspaper. And before the deal closed, the newspaper said, I use XYZ print. Like, is that okay? And the agency says, well, no, I really want to know more about your printer. And where do you get your paper from? Right? And like, who's your ink guy? And we laugh because it's crazy. Like, that would never happen. And yet, when any media is placed by an advertiser agency onto a publisher or an SSP or a network, those questions are very much part of the buying decision. So who does your research measurement? Who does your measurement? Who does your rich media? And I think the reason for that is because ad tech vendors have lots of money, very often VC and PE money, and they spend a lot of time going into advertisers and agencies and telling them, if you don't use my tech, it's going to fail. If you don't use my tech, outcomes are going to decrease. If you don't use my tech, you're going to, wake up in prison, right? And that's crazy. Like, we think about it and we're like, man, that's absolutely insane. Like, why should I give a crap who the television station is using for their tape deck because I want to run a 30-second spot? Like, you don't. And yet you go to a yacht in Cannes for a week, or you go to Vegas for a week for CES, and all that's being talked about is like, yeah, my tech, my tech, my tech. And I'm a little bit biased because I've spent most of my career in ad tech actually selling the tech and managing the tech. But think about that, right? Like, why would you spend all that time concerned with what is the enabling technology that's facilitating the transaction between this buyer and seller, and more about outcomes? So if I'm an agency, I don't care about the tech that you're using. That's not how reality is today. Agencies spend a lot of time forcing publishers and networks and SSPs, the supply side in general, to use the tech that has been sold to them. And this is nothing new. I mean, we all remember this from back in the day with rich media vendors, right? Like, ad tech vendors very quickly discovered in the purchase cycle that if you go to the advertiser, they will bring the publishers, right? Like, when demand and supply will always follow. And while that's true, I think it does a poor job of facilitating a transaction, facilitating the messaging coming from the buyer to the seller to the consumer. It doesn't solve anything. It doesn't do anything. But to make media buying decisions on what the last ad tech vendor that came in here and bought us lunch told us to do, it's crazy making, right? And yet it's exactly how we buy and sell in ad tech. And I think for the industry to grow and really mature, we have to start talking about the tech and talk about why this tech layer enables us to do what we really do well, which is drive outcomes for advertisers and marketers.
There's a lot to pull apart in that. I love the analogy around the 30-second spot on the air and not caring what machine that tape goes into. I actually think rich media as an example is the flip side of that. Like when I was a publisher, if we had vetted that the rich media vendor wasn't fraudulent and counted impressions properly, then we didn't really care which one you use. That was the thing. If someone came to us and said, we're using Innovid versus we're using, I'll go really back, like I Wonder versus something like that, right? It didn't really matter. It was just a vehicle. And, there was a fee that the agency paid or the advertiser paid in order to enable that. That's actually an incredible analogy to what it was. From the early days of the internet, it really was like that. There was no tech layer. The tech layer was the ad server and then potentially the rich media vendor. I love the focus on outcomes. I think that's absolutely true. The problem is there's an outcome measurement dispute across multiple sources. If I'm advertising in 6 different places and those 6 different places measure attribution differently, how am I even beginning to pull that together to understand which one is performing and which one isn't? Do you have any sense of like what the solve is around making tech more invisible so that we can focus on really understanding what it means to drive outcomes? No, independent of the tech, right?
Yeah. And so this is going to potentially make me enemies in the ad tech vendor world, but like we have to have fewer vendors, right? Like this shit is too complicated. There's too much money coming into agencies and pushing their way in the door and then saying, if I'm a Omnicom agency, we use tech XYZ for all of our inventory verification, all of our research, all of our rich media, to use your example, right? If I'm another holdco, right? If I'm Publicis, I'm going to use this other. So you can see the problem, right? I think the way that you begin to solve it is the winners have to take most, if not all. So the fact that we have 4 or 5 different companies that measure inventory quality, that measure performance, that measure outcomes, we're going to be stuck. And think about it this way, right? In the older days, whether we liked them or not, Nielsen is the currency that broadcast was built around, right? Arbitron was the currency that radio was built around. And for print, the Audit Bureau of Circulation, ABC, was the currency. Like, we're nowhere near that. And the problem is exactly as you said, different campaigns running on different properties using different measurement technologies. Like that's not a good situation either. So I think we should really rally as an industry around standards as quickly as we can. I mean, even something like inventory verification and inventory quality, right? Like you have advertisers that use multiple different vendors for the same advertisement, for the same media, right? And like, that's nuts. It's never going to work well as long as we have the standard bodies competing with one another about how this should be measured and how this should operate. That's not going to work. It has not worked for the last 27 years in ad tech, and it's not going to until we rally around, here's what we use. A couple of different companies do that and can enable it for you, but the technology is fundamentally the same. How we get there is a little bit different. Here's why maybe you still figure business, Mr. Agency, but the technology itself is fundamentally the same. If you watch a 30-second ad on broadcast as a consumer, and then you watch the one after, like, do you know who shot that? Do you know which satellite they're transmitting to the station? Of course not. It's laughable, but that's exactly what we do in ad tech, and it's got to stop.
I do love the analogy about the tape deck or the ink that goes in the printer. I think those are good comparisons. At the same time, like if I think about an advertiser who's been advertising for, 100 years, like let's take a Coca-Cola or somebody like that, their measurement, their vendors, what their advertising ecosystem looks like has been built up over a very long period of time. Like, how do we get from here to there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I've been in ad tech for a while. Ad tech, let's say, has been extant for 30 years. And the problems that we talk about in ad tech today, putting aside the vendor conversation, the problems that we have are many of the same problems that we had 25 years ago, right? And so I think you really have to understand why does the tech work the way that it does so that I can use it to drive the best outcome and understand, like, am I paying what this is worth? Do I know what I'm buying, right? So like, am I getting pre-roll on ESPN for $15 or am I getting pre-roll on ESPN for 85 cents? Now, there is no 85-cent ESPN pre-roll, as the three of us know all too well. Let's fake it's fraud. But like, we're in an industry where fraud has lost its meaning, right? Like, fraud is the shit you go to jail for in other industries, right? Like, you go to jail for bank fraud. You go to jail for like, defrauding a company. Fraud is just seen as like a rounding error or a cost of doing business. And that's nuts, especially when you have multiple companies, to my earlier point, that are providing these solutions, but they provide them in different ways. There is nothing worse than having the buy-side verification vendor and the sell-side verification vendor arguing with each other about whose technology is correct. We still talking about counting discrepancies. In 2026, we're talking about counting discrepancies. And that's just gotta stop. And I think that's what's holding us back as an industry in part.
While you were talking, I was just sort of thinking about it. Like, so if you're Coke, the idea that you would spend, as a manufacturer of soda, more time on your supply chain than on the people who are buying it is insane. That's fundamentally crazy. There's no successful manufacturer out there that's doing that. And in this analogy, Adtech is the supply chain.
That's right.
Can you imagine 60 cents of every advertising dollar goes to a tech company versus advertising to the consumer it's trying to sell to? So, to the extent that standards solves that, that's wonderful. Do you have any other thoughts around what it means to sort of solve for the idea that supply chain has this level of importance that seems insane?
I do think supply chain has a tremendous amount of importance. I do think it does impact outcomes. But to use your example, let's say Coke was the advertiser. Let's say Coke is a company that's been doing this for 100 plus years. And let's say you as the consumer are like, which bottling technology did you use, right? And do you really want 60% of Coke's margin going to the bottling company? Of course not. And do you want bottles to come from regions of the world where there's child labor? Of course not. But all of that is just part of doing business for Coke, right? Like, it should never impact the consumer. It should never be a situation where Coke is paying more to their vendors than they are for the actual product itself. Or what if they use multiple vendors for different cans? Is that good? Is that bad? Is one better than the other? Of course, their industry has developed so much such that the technology is invisible, right? I'm going to buy a Coke and I'm drinking that Coke. I give the can no thought whatsoever. Now, to keep using and beating this analogy, we do care about whether the Coke tastes good. And so if we've learned that one of our canning vendors just like tastes like poop, then we're going to stop using them. And that's where the supply chain becomes really, really important.
And so I just looked up while you were talking. Coca-Cola started advertising in 1886, according to the internet. So 140 years this year. And I think your point on supply chain is it's important, but not everybody needs to be thinking about it. Some people need to think about the outcome of the product, and some people need to think about the inputs, and it's a matter of who and where. Coca-Cola has had to think about who the bottlers are and what the cans are, and how does that impact the quality of the product. It's into their DNA. So you take that experience, that thought process, and apply it to everything you do, including the advertising. And then sometimes it might lead to a good outcome. And sometimes you end up with a whole lot of focus on something that probably didn't move the needle, where if you started the conversation, coming full circle here, on let's talk about outcomes rather than inputs, that a focus on outcomes gets you to the same place in probably a more productive way and a more thoughtful way and a more value-added way, I would imagine, too.
100%. The supply chain disappears, right? Like, if you were a buyer of Coke, okay, like the Coke tastes good, the supply chain isn't something you have to worry about. The one area that I would moderate that a little bit is around being responsible and sustainable, right? So you don't want to buy a soda can from a company that produced the soda using slave labor, right? Or to get back to our industry, you don't want to use a publisher that surrounds your advertising with porn. Right, we laugh, but it still happens. In 2026, it still happens. So I think there's a role for each player in the ad tech ecosystem to be responsible and to be accountable. But that's where it should end, right? Like, I don't really want to care about who the SSP is. I just want to care, did we serve the right ad to the right user at the right time on the right device? And what did that do to actually move sales as a company for us?
You mentioned standards, and I just want to hark back to what we discussed last week a little bit, which was specific to the MRC, but in this case, I want to broaden it. And I'm not necessarily asking you to make more enemies here, but what I will say is I think standards is a great idea. And I think to some extent we have them. The problem is they're self-regulating.
Yeah.
People opt out. They don't really care. Harold Geller, God bless his soul, was banging the drum on ad ID for like 20 years before he moved back to what I would call the private sector. But ad ID is a pretty elegant solution to manage around things like frequency and stuff like that. But he had trouble. It worked at the TV level because they needed a uniform code. That's just the way that medium functions. But in digital, it's just like, it's optional. I don't care. Who do you see helping to develop and are actually more importantly enforce the standards across? Because you really do need a neutral third-party body, and you need the big people to actually buy into the notion that this is worth regulating.
So I really love what my old colleague and friend Tony Katzer is doing at the IAB Tech Lab. He recognized that what matters right now is rallying around AI for Adtech. Because you could argue from now until Sunday that AI is going to drive better outcomes. I don't know if it is or it isn't, but at least we have a standards organization that is rallying around this new tech. They're informing players in the ad tech ecosystem what has to be done. They're explaining what the downsides are of not joining their solution. MRC is another great one. MRC 50 was and possibly is the standard for viewability at one or more major holdcos. But now, what if there are competitors to MRC? What if there are competitors to Tech Lab? It's an extreme example, but rallying around IB, rallying around Tech Lab, rallying around MRC is so critical to bury the tech. I hate to keep coming back to that point. For this to work and for ad tech to stop being a thing where everyone's got their hands in the cookie jar, the tech has to disappear. And for the tech to disappear, it has to be so good. Like my phone, I don't care where Apple sources the modem chip from. It's meaningless to me as a consumer. I just want to make sure it works. And so if we self-actualize as an industry and we get to a point where the tech disappears, think about how much smoother the transaction between buyer and seller is going to be. Think about how much happier buyers are going to be with their outcomes when they don't spend 40 cents of their working media dollar on tech, on yachts and can. Now everyone's going to hate me, but I said it. I said what I said. Yachts and can are bad.
I heard you say self-actualize, so at some point we're going to have a conversation about Maslow's hierarchy.
Yes.
However, I think this is a good place to call it.
I agree. Lewis, thanks so much. Really thought-provoking,
Thank you so
really
much.
Thoughtful, and thanks for being the first guest on here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a treat.
This episode was hosted and produced by Jeff Wallenitz and Greg McDonald with production support from Jess DeWeese. Please follow the show in your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. And if you or someone you know would make a great guest, we'd love to hear from you at leadershipinpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.